Hey, happy Tuesday morning to you, everyone. Hope you're having a good week so far. I appreciate so very, very much you being with me here on Morning Musings. This is video number 71 in our thematic study of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Hey, can you see that? Let me see, scoot over here. Okay, do you see that? One of our viewers sent that to me. That is a three-part picture of, obviously, a Mustang. They know I'm a Mustang guy. And I tell you what, they're obviously a really great artist. And I just appreciate that. I mean, that's just so ever cool. I love it. I've been a Mustang guy since way, way back. I'm not going to tell you how long, because I'll tell you how old I am. But anyway, again, thank you so very, very much. I really, truly appreciate that. Well, we've begun an examination of the fact that Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 uses the present passive indicatives and the present active indicatives to speak of the resurrection. Well, clearly that causes problems for the traditional views. Because if the resurrection that Paul is discussing in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is in fact physical resurrection, then that means that Paul was affirming, Paul was affirming that the resurrection was already taking place. So where were the physical bodies coming out of the holes in the ground? And by the way, since the resurrection is kind of an end of the age event, that would mean that Paul was affirming that the end of the age was present. Well, it's most assuredly true that Paul was affirming the end of the age was present. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. The end of the ages has come upon us, the goal of the ages. But it's pretty clear that Paul was not pointing to empty cemeteries going, guys, look, the graves are being opened. The cemeteries are being emptied. You know that, and I know that. And yet here is Paul arguing that the dead ones were being raised. I pointed out in the last video, number 70, how commentators continually struggle with this and how they seek to avoid the power of the present passives and the present active indicatives, all the while, by the way, insisting that we honor the other Greek tenses in the text. Now, to me, that raises a red flag. When you read the commentators say, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul says Christ must reign until the time of the end, and they tell us, well, you see, that's a present infinitive, and we must honor the present infinitive. And then they turn right around and say, well, no, we don't have to honor the present active indicatives or the present passive indicatives when it's talking about the resurrection. So we have to honor some of them, we don't have to honor the rest of them. Now, Greek is not an exact science. As some have said, it's an art. And I'm not an artist. But the point of fact is, when a person wants to argue from a presuppositional theological perspective and just simply wave his hand at an entire body of linguistics, that's problematic. Now, one argument that is given is, well, yes, as a matter of fact, the resurrection had begun. Because after all, Christ was physically resurrected, and He is the first fruit, and that means that the resurrection has begun. Wow, what a problem. I would ask you to go back and to look at the videos that examine Paul's argument that Christ was the first fruit. Paul uses the imagery of the festival, Israel's festivals. He uses imagery of the harvest. Now, folks, any farmer knows that when you gather the first fruit, the harvest has begun. You don't gather the first fruit and 2 millennia later, 2 seasons later, gather the harvest. Secondly, in other words, folks, it's just not possible. It violates the imagery of the harvest to say, okay, the first fruits have been gathered, that's Christ, but we're still waiting for the harvest. That destroys the imagery of the harvest language. Now, secondly, when we examine the issue of Christ being the first fruit, and if you argue on any level whatsoever that Christ was the first to be raised physically, you have destroyed your own theology. And people try to argue, oh, well, Paul's not arguing that Jesus was the first person to be raised. They're saying he was the first person to be raised, never to die again. No, that's not the imagery of the harvest. It is not the imagery in which Paul says each man in his own order. Christ, who's the first fruits, or Christ, the first of the first fruits, more technically speaking, and the first fruits, afterward those who are Christ. Paul is undoubtedly, with irrefutably, referring to order of occurrence, not kind. His focus is on Jesus was the first. So let me say again, if Paul is focused on physical resurrection, then Paul wasn't telling the truth when he said Jesus was the first to be raised from the dead, because Jesus was not the first to be raised from physical death. Thus, if a person argues, well, yes, the resurrection in fact had begun because Jesus was the first. Oh, wait a minute. The first. No, Jesus wasn't the first to be raised from physical death. He was the first to be raised from the death of Adam, which was not physical death. At any time that a person makes Paul's reference to the harvest, at any point of time at which they make Paul's reference to Jesus as the first to be raised from the dead, they thereby destroy the idea that the physical resurrection had begun, because Christ was not the first of the first person to be raised from physical death. It simply will not work. And yet over and over again, Paul affirms in other places, guess what? Christ has abolished death. Really? Had Christ abolished physical death? In 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 9, Paul affirms that Christ had delivered us from death. An aorist active indicative, which means it was a past reality continuing to the present day. Folks, when we honor the present passive indicatives and we harmonize it with Paul's statement that Christ was the first to be raised from the dead, it demands, number one, yes, indeed, the harvest had begun, but that cannot be physical resurrection. When we harmonize, not set other passages at odds with, but, pardon me, when we harmonize what Paul had to say in other texts with what Paul says, and in his use of the present passives in 1 Corinthians 15, then we have a beautiful, harmonious story in which we don't have to try to wave away Paul's tenfold use of the present passive indicatives. We can honor the fact that Paul said Christ had been raised, aorist active indicative, and stands raised to this present day. We can honor the fact that he said Christ had, in the past tense, aorist active indicative, destroyed death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. And we can also say, and we can also honor the fact that Paul was stating emphatically that Christ was the first to be raised from the dead, but not physical death. But that as a result of Christ being the first to be raised from the dead, that the dead who were part of the harvest which had begun were also being raised. And they were awaiting the end of the age and the harvest, which would occur at the parousia. There is literally no reason whatsoever to ignore or to deny the fact that Paul's use of the present passive indicatives demands that the dead were being raised. Let me state again, if we're going to honor the aorist active indicatives, if we're going to honor the perfect indicatives, then why don't we honor the present passive indicatives? And when we do, that destroys any futurist view of 1 Corinthians 15. Well, we've got more, so we'll see you on the flip side.